Merci Chuck, merci Monsieur l'Ambassadeur. Et permettez-moi de dire que c'est pour moi un véritable plaisir de me trouver dans la capitale d'une nation libre et prospère et conservatrice. Believe me, my friends, that's not something you get the chance to say very often in the European Union where I come from. And certainly not in French. You know, Chuck and I and the ambassador, we're all ex-politicians. We were swapping campaign stories as we do on these occasions. There is nothing like an election campaign to remind the elected politician of the full diversity of wildlife that he represents in his constituency. We had an election last year in Britain. I knocked on a door canvassing in a town in my constituency called Woking, and it was answered by a little boy who must have been all of about 5, 6 years old. And he was wearing an enormous velvet smoking jacket, hanging loosely from his little shoulders. In one hand, he was swirling an enormous balloon of brandy, about the size of his little head. And in the other hand, smouldering slowly ceilingwards, was this great sausage-sized Cuban cigar. Well, as you do when you're canvassing, I leaned down, I said, "Are your parents at home?" And he said, "Does it effing look as though my parents are at home?" So, believe me, my friends, when I tell you, it is such a pleasure to be in a place where nobody can vote for me, you know, or against me. I can see a number of elected representatives in the room. This is a home game for you guys, but this is an away game for me. But you know, although I may be a neutral here, I'm not disinterested. And no Briton can be disinterested about the politics of Canada. We've been through too much together. You're too close to us. And so I hope you will allow me to presume a little on our kinship and say a word or two about your present political situation and indeed about this conference. I've noticed in the last 48 hours, both on this stage and in the corridors around, that people have been doing exactly what the Conservative movement should be doing, which is to pick holes in what the Conservative government is doing. And that's great. You're the people who ought to be doing that, right? That's your job. That's what the broader movement is for. But don't lose sight of the big picture. Of all the major economies in the world, Canada's is the only one to have come through the recent crash without this explosion in debt and tax and spending. And that didn't just happen by accident. It's very natural when you're close to something that you focus on the things that you don't like. You know, I remember I was a schoolboy and then a student when Margaret Thatcher was Prime Minister in the United Kingdom. And that's what I did, it's what we all did. Oh, the Anglo-Irish Agreement, the Single European Act. I can now see, with the perspective of time, something that I can perhaps see with the perspective of distance about contemporary Canada. We didn't know how lucky we were. Don't lose the big picture. They say no man is a hero to his valet, right? If you're standing very close to somebody, silver screen star, you see that there's makeup and it may not be put on perfectly. But you know, looking from where I'm standing, I see this country led by a government of patriots who have restored prosperity and pride, and led by a Prime Minister who is a statesman of the first rank. And I wish we had someone like him on our side of the Atlantic. You know, I hope you don't mind I say those things, but I don't really feel I'm among strangers here. It's one of those bizarre accidents of history and geography. My constituency is 22 miles from Europe, but I would never presume to tell a continental audience about their own internal politics. I feel, as Abraham says in the good book, I feel that I'm a stranger and a sojourner among them. I don't feel that when I come here. We may be sundered by thousands of miles. Canada is a different country, a sovereign country, a separate country, but it's not, for us, really a foreign country. And that's why I hope you don't mind if I talk a little bit about what's happening in Canada and about what's happening in the wider Anglosphere, I want to make a point that perhaps has been made before from this podium that can't be said too often. This government, this Conservative government that you enjoy now, didn't happen in a vacuum. There was a change in the political climate that made it possible. And the man who most effected that change is Preston Manning. And it's a real privilege for me to be able to stand in this room and say this. He was a great hero of mine when I was a student, but I don't want to build him up as some kind of John the Baptist figure who just prepared the way for somebody else. He taught me something hugely important, which has been a lesson that stuck with me all the way through my time in elected politics, which is that you don't have to be wielding the levers of power in order to change your country. Simply by leading the opposition as he did, Preston put a country that was on the wrong course back on the right track. That's the power of conviction and principle and selflessness and leadership. And that's a lesson that I think all of us can learn from. So it's a huge privilege to be able to say that here. And it's a huge privilege to be able to welcome Canada back to the Anglosphere. You know, I was born in the kind of Trudeau years. And all the time that I was growing up, Canada was seen abroad as a kind of outpost of continental Europe in North America. Right? Conrad Black, my old boss, used to say, we're English-speaking Scandinavians, we Canadians, right? And I could see what he meant, both in terms of foreign policy and in terms of domestic policy. And it's perhaps only now that we've got to the end of that period, that we've got to a restoration of conservative principles here, that you can see quite what an aberration it was. You know, up until then, this country was defined by its self-reliance, its independence, its freedom. An enormous territory like this isn't settled by people, you know, whose main preoccupations are a nationalized healthcare system and the supremacy of the United Nations. And we of all people are delighted to see Canada back. The first time that Stephen Harper crossed my radar was his first trip abroad when he was leading the minority, his first foreign speech, I think, even as Prime Minister, when he was passing through London on his way to a G7 summit in St. Petersburg. And he made a beautiful and touching speech about the importance of the common law and parliamentary tradition as the basis of Canada's freedom. Now, as a matter of historical record, it was pretty uncontroversial. If he'd been speaking to a seminar of academic historians, it wouldn't have been an especially exciting thing to say. It was a rather obvious point. But, you know, what a change from what we'd had up until then, which was Canada as this happy multi-culti fusion of indigenous peoples and Acadians and illegal immigrants. You know, it was... And I thought, welcome back, and of all people, we have cause to be grateful to have you back. You know, in the First World War, 70,000 Canadians died at Vimy Ridge, at Passchendaele, and at the Somme. Of a population of 7 million, 70,000 fatalities. Another 45,000 in the Second World War, all for the sake of a country which, in most cases, they'd never set eyes on. So believe me when I say, no Briton can be disinterested about your politics. The sturdy common sense here of a patriotic people has now imposed itself on the preoccupations of a bien-pensant elite. The same has not happened in my country. You have convincingly rejoined the Anglosphere. We are still wrenched from our natural orbit and attached to the European Union. You've escaped your Trudopia. We are still stuck in Europe. And only now, perhaps, does the full implication of what our fathers did in the 1970s become clear. You know, when we joined the EU, most British people saw it as a kind of trade-off between the politics and the economics. All right, we'd be losing a little bit of sovereignty, that was a bad thing, but in exchange we'd be getting access to this great common market, right? Nobody looking across the channel today still makes that equation. We see what's happening on the continent, and we understand that European integration means the destruction of our democracy and the destruction of our prosperity. This is not something that's just been caused by the euro crisis. It's been decades since you could find any opinion poll in Britain suggesting that people would vote to remain in the European Union. It's a system that's emptied our seas, that's wiped out our countryside, and above all, it's a system that has vitiated our law and filleted our democracy. 4 out of every 5 laws and regulations in Britain now come from Brussels. Right? Come from people not just that we didn't vote for, but people that nobody voted for, by appointed European commissioners. You'll often hear it said that the European Commission is undemocratic in the sense that none of its members is elected. But you know what, my friends, it's worse than that. Uniquely, in Western civilization, the European Union has contrived a system which is in fact anti-democratic in the sense that you generally have to have lost an election before you're appointed to the European Commission. So it's only when you've been expressly rejected by your voters that you are invited to come and rule over them. Well, is it any wonder that a system deliberately invulnerable to public opinion, a system that was designed not to be immune to popular pressures, has led to this expansion of government, this explosion of debt, and, predictably enough, has ended up where we are now. Our treasuries are empty, our credit is exhausted, and the only solution that Brussels has to the debt crisis is to carry on borrowing and carry on spending. It's the American writer Mark Twain who said that if all you have is a hammer, everything starts to look like a nail, right? If you're a government and you spend money, this is what happens. Whatever the crisis, your first instinct is to reach for your wallet. Or rather, your first instinct is to reach for somebody else's wallet, because not a lot of people know this, bureaucrats are immune from national taxation. It's a fact that they don't bruit about very often, right? So when they talk about paying this price to keep the single currency together, it's of course not they who are going to be paying it. It's going to be a price that is inflicted on the peoples, and we can now see how high that price is. We are inflicting generational poverty and deflation and unemployment and emigration on the Mediterranean countries, and generational tax rises on the northern European countries in order to pay for the transfer payments. All in order to keep the euro together. All rather than admit that the single currency was a mistake. All in order to save face. To pluck an appropriately apt Greek metaphor, these must be the most expensive faces since Helen of Troy's, which launched 1,000 ships. And that's what we joined. Thinking that we were hitching our locomotives to this, we were hitching our wagons to this powerful locomotive, we've in fact shackled ourselves to a corpse. Let me give you a statistic that scared me when I first saw it. The year that we joined the European Union, 1973. Western Europe, which I'll define for these purposes as the 15 member states before we admitted the post-communist countries, Western Europe accounted for 38% of world GDP. Today, that figure is 24%, and in 2020, it will be 15%. Over the same period, Canada's share of the world GDP, and indeed the United States, has remained pretty solid. That is the generational shift in power and in wealth away from Western Europe. We have confined ourselves in a cramped and dwindling customs union. And in so doing, unforgivably, we turned away from the parts of the world where the growth still is. Not least this country and the wider community of free English-speaking democracies. Truly, that mistake that my father's generation made was the most calamitous in our recent history. I want to say a word or two about the Anglosphere, about the alliance of free English-speaking peoples. And let me say, je m'adresse à vous comme un admirateur convaincu de la culture française. Personne n'est plus conscient que moi de la contribution des francophones d'Europe et d'Amérique du Nord à la civilisation occidentale. When I talk about the Anglosphere, I am not positing a geographical or an ethnic unit, but rather a community of values. Indeed, one of the great contributions that my country made to the world was the development of the notion of a civic rather than an ethnic conception of nationhood. John Locke in his original compact. Something that makes us very different from a number of neighboring countries in Europe which define nationality in terms of blood and heritage or birth and territory, is that we had this idea that provided you bought into the values, it didn't matter where your parents came from. Go back 100 years, and 80% of British subjects were neither white nor Christian. This is not a new phenomenon, but they felt part of the brand. And hundreds of millions of them, twice in the last century, were prepared to cross half the world in order to take up arms for a country on which they'd never set eyes, because they felt part of those values. And that, I think, is something that we've bequeathed to all the other English-speaking democracies. Of course, it took form in the old courthouse in Philadelphia in the US. But it's also the basis of Canadian nationality, of Diefenbaker's one nation, one Canada. You know, the idea that provided you believe in freedom, in parliamentary supremacy, and in the shared values that we have, it doesn't matter where your grandparents came from. And what are those values? What is it that defines us as Anglosphere peoples? Well, the origin of it is something so sublime and so miraculous that the longer I think about it, the harder I find to explain it. And that's the common law. This extraordinary, providential idea that the law doesn't emanate from the government, but rather the law was already there and the government must be subject to it. That even the king and his ministers are forced to obey the folk right of inherited law that came from somewhere else. Where did it come from? Nobody really knows. We inherited it from our parents, they from theirs, and so on, back to some point lost in the early Anglo-Saxon settlements. I don't know how it happened, but it happened. And once it was there, it defined the relationship between state and citizen. On the basis of a common law system, we understood that the government was there as the servant of the rest of us rather than the other way around. Laws did not emanate from the legislature. It was not above the rest of us. The relationship between government and governed was a different one. And from that basis comes all of the other things which the English-speaking peoples have given to the world. Representative government, control of the executive by the legislature, this extraordinary idea that taxes should not be levied nor laws passed except by our own elected representatives. Property rights enforced by an independent magistracy, free contract, personal freedom, they all go back to that extraordinary idea of common law. And it's made our countries prepared to take up arms where necessary in defense of those values. Not every country has a great story to tell. You look back at the great conflicts of the last century. How many countries were consistently on the right side in the First World War, in the Second World War, in the Cold War? Who consistently got the big calls right? It's a fairly small number. But it includes all of the Anglosphere democracies. You, us, the United States, Australia, New Zealand. And why is that? Well, something made people prepared to take up arms for freedom. And they may not have defined it in terms of some lecture about common law, but they would have understood deep in their marrow that they were defending a system that was free against a system that was tyrannical. You look at the enormous war memorials here in Canada. Ask yourself, were those young men crossing the ocean simply out of some kind of tribalism? Simply because of some coincidence of language? Was it no different from the breakup of Yugoslavia or the Hutus and the Tutsis? Was it simply some kind of ethnic identification with Britain, or wasn't it a belief that we were fighting for a better way of life, a way of life where the citizen was free and where the government couldn't exalt itself over the individual? That's a pretty good story. And it's a story that we shouldn't be ashamed to pass on to our children. They're not just a random set of individuals born to another random set of individuals. They are the inheritors of a sublime tradition. Not far from here, there's a grave which contains the remains of my late uncle. He was training here during the Second World War, and he was a fatality during a training exercise. It's not a very glamorous way to end. They don't make films about it, but it was a very common fate for a lot of people, a lot of participants in that conflict. More people were killed in training in the preparation for D-Day than were killed in enemy action after the landings. Of course, this was a long way from home. And a couple of years after the funeral, which my late grandfather couldn't make, he got a letter from a Canadian woman. She'd inferred from the inscription on the grave that The family was distant, and she'd sent a photograph. She said, "I'll look after it." We never met her. My aunt lives in New Zealand, in Auckland. This is her 90th year. 2 years ago, she got a round-the-world ticket, and for the first time, she was able to come and pay her respects at her brother's grave here in Canada. It's a small Anglosphere story. It's not nearly as dramatic and exciting as some. But it reminds us of what it was that we were fighting for and what it was that we have in common and what we still could have in common as free people living under our own laws and our own parliaments. Our fathers, yours and mine, were prepared to defend with force of arms our independence, our liberty. It doesn't matter where our ancestors came from. We are all joint inheritors of that sublime patrimony. It's our privilege and it's our task to cling fast to that heritage and to pass it on intact to our children.
Well, so I warned you to hang on to your seats. So this is a great start. We got time for a few questions, and as one of the earlier moderators had mentioned, let's try to keep it to the questions. Comments are welcome, but only if it leads up to a pretty quick question. So I'll kind of watch that, and we'll start here, and then we'll go back and forth from mic to mic. Go ahead.
I don't think I've ever actually followed such an amazing presentation, so I'm feeling clumsy already as I begin to speak. So first of all, when you were describing being in England and looking across the channel to these other organizations and governments that were spending your money, coming from the West, we sometimes feel that way as we look across the Rockies to Ontario. But my question for you is that as with anything, there's an ebb and a flow, and there are trends, and there are moments in time where people look and learn lessons. Is it possible that right now within England and within hopefully Canada and some other countries that we're looking at the lessons of the EU and the lessons from Greece, and that this may in fact gel us together as conservatives and set some trends for perhaps in the next 50 years where we do see austerity and fiscal responsibility coming back to our countries?
Thank you. Well, here's an interesting fact that occurred to me. I was in Australia 2 weeks ago as part of my Anglosphere tour, and the Australian Labour Party is in meltdown. They've got a majority of 1 or 2, depending on whether you count the Speaker, and I can't imagine that they will see out the year. We will then, if Tony Abbott, as I fervently hope, wins the election in Australia, there will be a full house of conservative Anglosphere governments for the first time. It's like Halley's Comet. It kind of only happens every however many years, you know, in Canada, in the United Kingdom, in Australia, in New Zealand, even in Ireland. And we're just waiting for the last piece of the jigsaw to fall into place. Now, why is that happening? Why is that? Well, I don't think people have changed their minds. I think one of the things that all of those countries have in common is that people are wiser than their leaders. You know, had this policy of the bank bailouts and the expansion of government been put to referendum in any of the participating countries, I suspect it would have been thrown out. And yet, almost everywhere, there was a political unanimity in the panicky days following the Lehman crash. We must do something. We've got, and that something, of course, is always spending money. You know, politicians in their panic turned to the one set of people who could not give them disinterested advice, namely bankers. Well, if you ask a banker whether you should subsidize banks, what do you expect him to say? You know, if you ask the bakers whether we should subsidize bakeries, what would you expect them to say? You know, they're the one lot of people you don't ask. And I remember at the time being one of a tiny number of elected British Conservatives who was against. And a very senior member of my party sent me a stroppy email saying, "Hannan, you are completely on your own on this. You know, you and Ron Paul," he said, "you're out on your own on this bailout." And 2 weeks later, I saw the first opinion poll, and pasted it into a very smug email, which I sent back to him saying, oh, look, it turned out to be me, Ron Paul, and 82% of the British electorate, right? People are wiser than their leaders. You know, people understood that you should, and it's that wonderful Burkean wisdom, you know, don't mistake the importunate chink of the crickets for the wise cattle chewing the cud in silence. Don't imagine that those who make all the noise are the only inhabitants of the field. What could we do about it if we get this alignment of Anglo-spherist governments? We're the problem. You know, the United Kingdom is, if you then try and go beyond the goodwill of the English-speaking peoples and try and translate it into concrete policy and say, let's have a free trade area, let's have a free labor movement, let's have enhanced military cooperation, you keep bumping up against the realities of EU membership. And that's why I've made it my life's work to restore our independence.
Two quick questions. The first one is, can you repeat your opening comment in English? And the second one is, you've spent a lot of time saying very nice things about us, which we greatly appreciate, of course. But do you see any difficulties or dangers, things we should be worried or alert about in Canada?
Thank you. I'm reassured to see that Canadians will still struggle to take a compliment and will look for the downside. That, as someone with a Scottish Presbyterian mother, it makes me feel very much at home. My opening remarks was that it was a pleasure to be in a country that was free and prosperous and conservative, or at least in the capital of such a country. And you know, for a long time, as I was growing up, you couldn't say that very often about Canada, even when there was a notionally Tory government. And this is why I say, don't lose sight of the big picture. You know, in a world full of governments which are running enormous deficits and are grotesquely expanding state power, you know, the little 10% of it that you did here and which you're now reversing from, you know, believe me when I tell you, there is almost not a politician in Europe who would not gladly swap our problems for yours tomorrow.
There has been some discussion in this side of the pond about the Anglosphere. I remember in particular a series of letters exchanged in a rabid right-wing rag known as the National Post. But one idea which has been floated is that the members of the English-speaking countries should get the heck out of existing commitments like the EU, NATO, United Nations, and form their own political and possibly military organization, which we, for want of a better term, we will call the Anglosphere. What are your views on this?
I'm in favor.
Hey, my question's for former Ambassador Wilkins. Governor Mitch Daniels, in his response to the State of the Union, sort of outlined a conservative future, an idea of how a conservative future would work in the United States and going forward. And it was really different than just saying he was, instead of just basically critiquing what the Obama administration had done, he also provided a way saying this is what we would do differently and this is sort of our vision for the future. And do you think that in going into this election campaign, it's important to not only be critical, and of course we can all be critical of the Obama administration, but more so making sure that we provide that alternative for a vision for America in the future? And what would you say to that, and what is that vision?
Well, absolutely. And first of all, thanks for asking me the question. I was beginning to feel like you didn't love me for a minute. You're exactly right. I mean, you can't just criticize the other side. I mean, whether it's Mitt Romney or whoever our nominee is, has got to lay out for the American people how they will do it and the vision going forward. But I think that among the candidates for president on the GOP side, I mean, I think that vision is pretty uniform. I mean, we've got to stop spending money we don't have, and we've got to pull back the regulations and let free enterprise thrive in the United States. That's what made us great. And we've got to restore individual rights and freedoms to the American people, and don't overburden them with taxation, don't overburden them with regulations. But you're exactly right. You can't just criticize the other team. You got to lay out your vision. And you know, the American people they're looking for leadership. And whether they like somebody or not, in the end, leadership wins. And if they think they are the leader to take us forward, then they'll elect them. And I believe that, you know, it's going to be a tough election. I think there are a lot of people talking about now this primary season, we're just beating each other up. I actually think it's good for the Republican Party. For example, Ohio, had it not been in play, and Romney barely won it, but had it not been in play, he wouldn't have the ground organization and have the precinct organization in parts of Ohio that he's got now. And as I mentioned, he has, I think, won 6 or 7 of the swing states that have already had primaries. And so those are states where he's organized. And so it vets you, it helps you get organized, and it lets the American people feel like they're part of the process. Unlike years ago, we after Iowa, New Hampshire, South Carolina, and maybe Florida, the election was over. And what many of the state Republican parties did, they went to pro rata distribution of the delegates, and that obviously protracts it and makes it a longer process. But I think in large part that's helpful and healthy. It also means once you get a lead, it's hard to lose it because it's a lot harder for the other guy to catch up with you. And that's why I believe the numbers just look like Romney's going to eventually win, and eventually the other guys will run out of money and they'll get out. Then the motivating factor is take back the White House, and I think you'll see the Republican Party come together, and then starting in June or maybe July, you'll see that vision laid out by the Republican nominee.
We're going to try to get through the people that are still standing, or that are standing at the mics. There's 3 of you, so if you're quick with the questions and the answers, we'll get through this. So go ahead.
Once again, coming back to the question of Europe, in the last couple months, there's been Prime Minister Cameron's refusal to sign on to the new fiscal arrangement, basically the European countries sacrificing control of national budgets to basically back to the European Commission, or to the European government. There's been comments in the British press about how this is going to leave Britain as an outsider in Europe. I guess the question would be, moving forward, how do you see Britain's relationship with the European Union moving forward from here?
We had an opportunity. The new fiscal union treaty could have been the main body that became the political union, leaving the European Union. So, you know, you'd have two separate bodies, if you like. You'd have the old European Union, the EU, which would kind of become a shell as its powers drained, to the new FU, which initials neatly summarize the attitude which its leaders take to their peoples. You know, you're Greek and you're fed up with paying all this money to foreign bankers, FU. You know, or you're Irish and you're fed up with your referendums being swatted at FU. Or, you know, that opportunity sadly has passed because we've effectively climbed down from the substance of the veto, if not the fact of not signing up. Ultimately, this issue is going to have to be determined by a referendum. The question of Britain's relations with the EU is going to have to be done through an act of collective national endeavour. My short-term energies now in Britain are all on the referendum campaign. If we can put enough pressure on candidates of all parties in individual seats to commit themselves to voting for an in or out vote, sooner or later one of the parties will turn and swim with the current. You can't struggle on forever against public opinion. Now, I will accept the result of the referendum either way. You know, if I've misread the temper of my countrymen, if they vote to stay in, they weigh the thing up and they like it, that's it. I will retire quietly from public life. I'll grit my teeth, you know, accept it with good grace. I'll never again come and trouble your Manning Centre conferences in Ottawa. But let's at least have the vote. You know, the only argument now against a referendum is fear of the outcome, and in a democracy, that is not a good reason.
To use a different phrase than grit your teeth, that's a Canadian thing. We'll talk about that later. Over here.
I'd like to thank both of you for all of your positive comments about Canada. I think that's something that is very good for us to hear and also to learn how to appreciate. Especially Mr. Hannan, I'd like to thank you for reminding us that the purpose of law is actually supposed to be to protect freedom. And I was wondering if you could give us any ideas that you might have about how we could promote more of this type of culture here. Thank you.
Look, like I mentioned, I'm in an Anglosphere tour at the moment. I've just been in Australia. One of the things that we had in the United Kingdom that we've lost, but that still survives here and in the United States and in Australia, is federalism. or some kind of jurisdictional competition at a subnational level. And it is the biggest constraint on government. You know, you can only get away with increasing your taxes, your regulations, up to a certain point if there is a more competitive jurisdiction next door towards which people can flee. And one of the real tragedies of the United Kingdom is that as part of the process of centralizing all of our powers in Brussels, of pushing all our jurisdiction upwards, we've lost that municipal autonomy, that proper localism that our great-grandfathers would have taken for granted. So the single biggest thing you have going for you, the thing from which everything else will follow, is provincial autonomy. If I were a Canadian politician, my big issue would be taking power from Ottawa and giving it to the provinces, and then taking power from the provincial governments and giving it to the local councils.
My name is Jessie Legary. I'm from BC. And Mr. Hannan, you spoke a lot about a common heritage of common law and how important that is to our founding principles and moving forward. My question relates to foreign affairs then. How do you see us promoting democracy, and is that even possible in tribal nations where they don't have that common heritage? So just how successful you see that being?
Well, one of the things that makes the EU different from the traditional policy of the US and now of Canada is that they are not interested in promoting democracy. They're interested in promoting stability. And stability is very handy for the people who happen to be in power in any given place. It's not always so handy for the people living under that system. The Soviet Union was a remarkably stable system, but it wasn't much fun to live there. I do not believe that people are, that countries are unsuited for freedom. You know, the Nobel Prize-winning economist Amartya Sen made a great observation where he said, "Don't ask whether a nation is fit for democracy. It becomes fit through democracy." The more people become accustomed to interacting as free citizens, the more they get the hang of it, and it's a process that will grow. But when you speak about tribal countries and so on, I think there is one important qualifier. For a democracy to work, there has to be some sense of community of identity. People have to feel that they have a certain amount in common one with another. That's why democracy will never work at European Union level. That's why on the day that I got in 1999 as an MEP, I was elected on a smaller turnout than the number of people who voted the following day in the eviction round of our version of Big Brother, right? That's the disconnect between the European Parliament and the European peoples. Not I think because they had it in for me personally, or maybe they did, but it's simply because nobody really feels European in the same sense that somebody might feel Norwegian or Canadian or Japanese or whatever it is. And so where there are artificial boundaries and where there is a lack of community of identity, it is difficult, because to have a democracy, you need a unit with which we identify when we use the word we. One of the speakers in the Quebec session this morning was making a point about multiculturalism, about the importance of arriving in a country and identifying with the we, the new we, being the unit to which you've come, what you would call a demos, right? If you take the demos out of a democracy, you're left with a kratos. You're left with a power of a system that has to compel by force of law what it can't ask in the name of civic patriotism.
Okay, well, thank you very much. And maybe that's a good segue, if I can use it, to that sense of commonality that you spoke of there in your last remarks, which reminds me of a little bit of the brochure that you've seen, you know, for the Manning Center, which is this is a family get-together. And I don't know what you thought, but I thought it's pretty nice to see other parts of the Conservative family, live and well, thriving in the United States of America, Great Britain, and other places around the world. And I just want to, if you would join with me in thanking these folks as being part of our Conservative family, and they're welcome back anytime they like.
You didn't frankly have the balls to put country before party.